Hello, welcome to Mastering Java Volume 2. I'm Jason with CodeLearner.com. In this lesson we're going to continue our skills with learning how to program Java using step-by-step examples and code snippets here. And what we're going to do in this section is we're going to finally learn how to take input from the keyboard, because doing that allows you to have a lot more fun with programming. So in this case we'll be learning how to read a single character in from the keyboard, and then in this lesson and the subsequent lessons we'll be using that input to drive the program flow. And so this is something very, very common. Now there are a couple of different ways to do keyboard input in Java. Some of them are more complicated than others. So what we're going to do now is use the least complicated way to get keyboard input into Java. But as you're going to find in a few minutes, it's not really the most powerful way. But for a very simple introductory class like this is really the easiest way to do it once you get the hang of it. Now a lot of times in programming, I've mentioned before, early on there are a few things that you don't quite understand everything about. Like these keywords here we haven't talked a lot about. We'll get to that later when we talk about methods and object-oriented nature of Java. In this case, when we're doing the keyboard stuff, there's going to be a couple of things that you're not going to totally understand at first. You'll just have to kind of go with it, and as we dive deeper into Java, you'll understand what everything means. So what I'm going to do now is show you how to take that keyboard input using Java. So what we need to do first is something that, again, is a little oddball. We're going to take this bracket here, this opening bracket that drives our main method, that opens and defines our main method here, and we're going to put the following text, and you're going to need this every time we read a keyboard entry using this method here. So you need to type in throws java.io.IOE exception, and you'll hit a space bar. Notice I'm not putting a semicolon here. If you put a semicolon here, you get all kinds of red underlining. It goes crazy. I'm not putting anything like this, which would indicate that it was some sort of function. I'm putting it just like this. Now, I'm going to get into this a whole lot later, but basically this is part of Java's error handling. We're going to be reading characters in from the keyboard, and so Java is going to be expecting certain information to be coming from the keyboard, and if for some reason your program doesn't behave properly because it gets an invalid keyboard input, this is part of Java's error catching, for lack of a better word. We're going to discuss this keyword and all of this stuff in great detail later, but for now you're just going to have to include that right before the opening curly brace in the main method when we're going to be taking keyboard input like this. Alright, the next thing I want to do is we need to define the character that we plan to read from the keyboard. We need to create a variable to hold it, in other words. Alright, so let's go ahead. Let me go ahead and back this up here. Let's go ahead and define that. It's going to be a character data type because we're reading a single character from the keyboard, and I'm going to name it input. So we're just defining a variable to hold whatever value we're capturing from the keyboard. Alright, and now we need to usually put something to the screen, print something to the screen to tell the user to type something in. So let's do system.out.print ln like this, right? And we'll just say enter something from the keyboard, and let's make it a little more explicit, a single character from the keyboard, and we'll have a space like that, and let's just be more clear, then press enter like this. So really this is just a statement that's going to print to the screen, enter a single character from the keyboard, then press enter. Alright, so let's go to the next line. So this has nothing to do with inputting from the keyboard. This is just printing something to the screen. Now we need to actually accept the input from the keyboard. So notice that this was system, that means the system you're operating on, .out, that means this is outputting to the screen, and here's the print method, the print line method here that we've been using all along. So the complement to the system.out is, you might have guessed, system.in. Right? So the way we're going to do this is we're going to say that the variable input, which we just created, is going to be equal to whatever we accept from the keyboard, which is going to be system.in.read. Right? And you can see that Java's trying to help me. It's telling me it's got a read method here. It's part of input stream, and so on. So I'm going to hit double parentheses like that, and close it off. Everything looks okay. You would think this is exactly how you would do it. However, if you hover over it, it's going to tell you it's a type mismatch. Cannot convert from integer to character. What you really need to do every single time, you need to put a parentheses and put char in front. And if you remember, we talked about this in volume 1. What's happening is when we take an input from the keyboard using the system.in.read method, it's reading that keyboard input, but it's reading it as an integer. It's reading it as a number. And so it's coming in as a number, but yet we've defined a character variable here to hold it. So we need to convert from integer into character. And this guy here, this parentheses, is basically saying whatever you read in, convert it to a character, and then stick it in my variable there. Now I'd like to show you something really quickly that will probably help you understand that a little bit more. This is a chart. It's not a complete chart, but it shows the Latin letters of the alphabet on your keyboard. Notice you have A, B, C, D, and lowercase a, b, c, d, and so on. You also have the special characters, the shift characters, and some other characters such as form, feed, carriage, return, some of these things that are non-printable but yet are part of the keyboard input. But notice that everything that you would type in, like all of your numbers, your letters, uppercase, lowercase, they all have a corresponding ASCII value. These are just numbers. So really, behind the scenes, all these years when you were using a keyboard, if you type a lowercase e, it really corresponds to the number 101. And if you type the uppercase e, it corresponds to the number 69. Right? Now notice that these two differ, the uppercase and the lowercase, always differ by 32. That's just a fact that you might use later on. We'll have something like that in the exercises for you to use. But lowercase p, uppercase p is a difference of 32. Lowercase w, uppercase w is a difference of 32. What I'm trying to show you here is that, prior to programming, you might have thought that the keyboard just sends letters off to your screen, but really the keyboard is sending numbers. So when you type the capital C, the number 67 is sent to your program, and that's a number. It's an integer, but we know that it represents the letter capital C. That's what the ASCII definition is telling us. So when we do a system.in.read input from the keyboard, it's reading that number. And that number that comes back, we need to convert it to the character representation that we know that it represents, and then we store all this in character form into our variable, which we have defined to be a character. So this is something that you're going to do every single time you accept a keyboard input. Alright, so now we have our keyboard input. We've stored it in our variable called input, and now we would like to show this. So let's go ahead and put it out to the screen. So system.out.println like this, and then we'll put the character you type was, and then we'll go ahead and output it as input. Alright, so make sure you 110% understand what's going on here. We define a variable to hold our keyboard input. We print something out on the screen to tell everybody to press a single character, press enter. We input it. Of course, it always comes in as an integer. We store it as a character into this variable, and then we print the message out and put exactly what the user typed in. So in Eclipse here, when you run this, what you're going to see down here is enter a character from the keyboard, then press enter. So you click your mouse down here. You see the mouse is now waiting for keyboard input. The cursor there. So let me go ahead and put lowercase r. Notice how it's in kind of a hard to read green there. If I hit the enter key on my keyboard, then it says the character you typed was, and here it is, lowercase r. So if I run it again, everything disappears. I click down here. Let's say I do an uppercase T, and now I hit enter. The character I typed was T. Let me run it one last time. Down here, let's put a $sign. That's a character, a valid character from the keyboard. If I go ahead and hit enter, then the character I typed was a $sign. Alright, so now we have the basics of keyboard input in Java. This system.in.read is really intended to read a single character at a time. It's not intended to read large numbers in, like 1005. It's not intended to read sentences or strings of characters or anything other than really one character at a time. In fact, there are several gotchas with using this for anything more complicated than what we're doing here, and we're going to cover those gotchas in the next section. But for now, just use it to read single characters at a time. So here we've input something from the keyboard. We've just output it to the screen. We can change this a little bit. Let's go and take this out for here for now. Right? Now let's do a test on whatever the user types in. Let's say if the user types in the number 1, then we output a message. If the user types anything else but the number 1, then we have some other message. So we can have something like if input, that's what we've typed in, is equal to the number 1. Now notice that we want to put the number 1 in single quotes because here we're asking if the input's equal to the character number 1. That's the character on the keyboard. If you take this out, it's going to behave differently because what we're storing it as is a character. So we're doing a character comparison, right? So if they type the number 1 in, then we can do system.out.println, and we can say something like, you typed the number 1, something like this. Put a semicolon there. Notice that we have a single line if statement, so it's if and then it's a single line. This happens if the if is true. So then what if anything else is typed? The easiest way to do that would be if the input is not equal to 1. That would be anything else typed to the keyboard. Then we do system.out.println. You did not type in the number 1. Something like this, right? So we're just doing simple if comparison on what we have input here. So let's go ahead and do it in here. Enter a single character from the keyboard. If we enter the number 1, then it outputs you type the number 1. And if we put anything else, like the letter R, let's say, it says you did not type the number 1. So you can see it's a very simple way to drive your program flow because you can read single characters in from the keyboard. I want to go over a couple quick things before we close this section. I've mentioned them a couple times, but they're so important for you to understand. The first one is that when you're using system.in.read, it's intended for single characters to be read in. There's some gotchas we'll talk about in the next section. All right. When you read it in using this method, it's reading it in as an integer, and that's why we have to convert that integer to character in order to store it in the character variable. So this whole method of defining a character to hold the input, and then this kind of snippet here on the right, you're going to use all the time anytime you read a single character in using this method. All right. Once you have it stored in your variable, you can use it freely in your program, just like you can use any character variable in a program. The other thing I want to talk about is this again up here at the top. Notice I showed you the input values of a keyboard. They all correspond to these numbers. So Java has a very robust, what we call exception handling. When you see the word exception or hear the word exception, it means error. Error that occurs at runtime. See, this program has no idea what you're going to type into the keyboard. You could type anything onto the keyboard. In fact, what if you had a faulty keyboard? Just to say, what if you had a keyboard that, notice that this goes up to just over 100 values here. What if I had a faulty keyboard, when I pressed the button it returned 1 million? Clearly 1 million is not on this chart at all. That would be a crazy error. The keyboard would be malfunctioning. So this statement up here involving the word throws up here, an IO exception, it's all intended to just look at the keyboard input and try to catch errors coming from it. Now, what does it do with it and how does it handle it? All that stuff is going to be covered much later in Java programming, but you have to have this in here. If I try, for instance, to comment the throws out here, I'll put another opening curly brace here so it doesn't complain about that, and try to run the program here. It says errors exist in this project, proceed with launch. And of course it's not going to work if you try to do it. That's because this guy has to be present whenever we're doing the keyboard input using system.in.read. The other thing I'm going to say is that there are other ways to read keyboard input that require a little more explanation. We're going to get to those a little bit later, but for now this is how you read single characters into Java program. I want you to go off to the exercises and really work through those because you'll get a lot of practice doing this, and it's a very important, any kind of programming language, learning how to read input from a keyboard.